Okay.
Okay.
Say hi, Brendan.
Recording. Oh, okay.
So we are reading Farmer Giles of Ham by JRRTolkein.
That looks like a new book.
Farmer Giles of Ham. Agidi ahino barbi Juli agricole de hamo. Domini de domito Aule draconeri comites regini minimi regis et Thessale imra facinore et mirabilis exortis. Or, in the vulgar tongue, the rise and wonderful adventures of Farmer Giles, Lord of Tame, Count of Worminghall, and King of the Little Kingdom.
Story. Just watch and listen.
Forward. Of the history of the Little Kingdom, few fragments have survived, but by chance, an account of its origin has been preserved. A legend, perhaps, rather than an account, for it is evidently a late compilation, full of marvels derived not from sober annals, but from the popular lays to which its author frequently refers. For him, the events that he records lay already in a distant past, but he seems nonetheless to have lived himself in the lands of the Little Kingdom. Such geographical knowledge as he shows, it is not his strong point, is of that country, while of regions outside it, north or west, he is plainly ignorant. An excuse for presenting a translation of this curious tale out of its very insular Latin into the modern tongue of the United Kingdom may be found in the glimpse that it affords of life in a dark period of the history of Britain, not to mention the light that it throws on the origin of some difficult place names. Some may find the character and adventures of its hero attractive in themselves. The boundaries of the Little Kingdom, either in time or space, are not easy to determine from the scanty evidence. Since Brutus came to Britain, many kings and realms have come and gone. The partition under Locrine, Camber, and Albonac was only the first of many shifting divisions. What with the love of petty independence on the one hand, and on the other the greed of kings for wider realms, the years were filled with swift alternations of war and peace, of mirth and woe, as historians of the reign of Arthur tell us, a time of unsettled frontiers, when men might rise or fall suddenly, and songwriters had abundant material and eager audiences. Somewhere in those long years after the days of King Cole, maybe, but before Arthur or the 7 kingdoms of the English, we must place the events here related, and their scene is the valley of the Thames, with an excursion northwest to the walls of Wales. The capital of the Little Kingdom was evidently, as is ours, in its southeast corner, but its confines are vague. It seems never to have reached far up the Thames into the west, nor beyond Otmore to the north. Its eastern borders are dubious. There are indications in a fragmentary legend of Georgius, son of Giles, and his page Sovatarelius Suet, that at one time an outpost against the Middle Kingdom was maintained at Farthinghoe. But that situation does not concern this story, which is now presented without alteration or further comment, though the original grandiose title has been suitably reduced to Farmer Giles of Ham. Agidius de Hamo was a man who lived in the midmost parts of the island of Britain. In full, his name was Agidius Ahenobarbus Julius Agricola de Hamo, for people were richly endowed with names in those days, now long ago, when this island was still happily divided into many kingdoms. There was more time then, and folk were fewer, so that most men were distinguished. However, those days are now over, so I will, in what follows, give the man his name shortly and in the vulgar form. He was Farmer Giles of Ham, and he had a red beard. Ham was only a village, but villages were proud and independent still in those days. Farmer Giles had a dog. The dog's name was Garm. Dogs had to be content with short names in the vernacular. The book Latin was reserved for their betters. Garm would not talk even dog Latin, but he could use the vulgar tongue, as could most dogs of his day, either to bully or to brag or to wheedle in. Bullying was for beggars and trespassers, bragging for other dogs, and wheedling for his master. Garm was both proud and afraid of Giles, who could bully and brag better than he could.
I love Garm.
The time was not one of hurry or bustle, but bustle has very little to do with business. Men did their work without it, and they got through a deal both of work and of talk. There was plenty to talk about, for memorable events occurred very frequently. But at the moment when this tale begins, nothing memorable had, in fact, happened in Ham for quite a long time, which suited Farmer Giles down to the ground. He was a slow sort of fellow, rather set in his ways, and taken up with his own affairs. He had his hands full, he said, keeping the wolf from the door. That is, keeping himself as fat and comfortable as his father before him. The dog was busy helping him. Neither of them gave much thought to the wide world outside their fields, the village, and the nearest market. But the wide world was there. The forest was not far off, and away west and north were the wild hills, and the dubious marches of the mountain country. And among other things still at large, there were giants, rude and uncultured folk, and troublesome at times. There was one giant in particular, larger and more stupid than his fellows. I find no mention of his name in the histories, but it does not matter. He was very large. His walking stick was like a tree, and his tread was heavy. He brushed elms aside like tall grasses, and he was the ruin of roads and the desolation of gardens, for his great feet made holes in them as deep as wells. If he stumbled into a house, that was the end of it. And all this damage he did wherever he went, for his head was far above the roofs of houses, and left his feet to look after themselves. He was nearsighted and also rather deaf. Fortunately, he lived far off in the wild, and seldom visited the lands inhabited by men, at least not on purpose. He had a great tumble-down house away up in the mountains, but he had very few friends, owing to his deafness and his stupidity, and the scarcity of giants. He used to go out walking in the wild hills, and in the empty regions at the feet of the mountains, all by himself. One fine summer's day, this giant went out for a walk, and wandered aimlessly along, doing a great deal of damage in the woods. Suddenly he noticed that the sun was setting, and felt that his supper time was drawing near, but he discovered that he was in a part of the country that he did not know at all, and had lost his way. Making a wrong guess at the right direction, he walked and he walked until it was dark night. Then he sat down and waited for the moon to rise. Then he walked and walked in the moonlight, striding out with a will, for he was anxious to get home. He had left his best copper pot on the fire, and feared that the bottom would be burned. But his back was to the mountains, and he was already in the lands inhabited by men. He was, indeed, now drawing near to the farm of Agidius Ahenobarbus Julius Agricola, and the village called, in the vulgar tongue, Ham. It was a fine night. The cows were in the fields, and Farmer Giles' dog had gone out and gone for a walk on his own account. He had a fancy for moonshine and rabbits. He had no idea, of course, that a giant was also out for a walk. That would have given him a good reason for going out without leave, but a still better reason for staying quiet in the kitchen. At about 2 o'clock, the giant arrived at Farmer Giles' fields, broke the hedges, trampled on the crops, and flattened the mowing grass. In 5 minutes, he had done more damage than the royal fox hunt could have done in 5 days. Garm heard a thump, thump coming along the riverbank, and he ran to the west side of the low hill on which the farmhouse stood, just to see what was happening. Suddenly, he saw the giant stride right across the river and tread upon Galathea, the farmer's favorite cow, squashing the poor beast as flat as the farmer could have squashed a black beetle. That was more than enough for Garm. He gave a yelp of fright and bolted home, quite forgetting that he was out without leave. He came and barked and yammered underneath his master's bedroom window. There was no answer for a long time. Farmer Giles was not easily wakened. "Help! Help! Help!" cried Garm. The window opened suddenly, and a well-aimed bottle came flying out. "Ow!" said the dog, jumping aside with practiced skill. "Help! Help! Help!" Out popped the farmer's head.
"Drat you, dog! What be you a-doing?"
said he. "Nothing," said the dog.
"I'll give you nothing. I'll flay the skin off you in the morning,"
said the farmer, slamming the window. "Help! Help! Help!" cried the dog. Out came Giles' head again.
"I'll kill you if you make another sound," he said. "What's come to you, you fool?"
"Nothing," said the dog, "but something's come to you."
"What do you mean?"
said Giles, startled in the midst of his rage. Never before had Garm answered him saucily. "There's a giant in your fields, an enormous giant, and he's coming this way," said the dog. "Help! Help! He is trampling on your sheep. He has stamped on poor Galathea, and she's as flat as a doormat. Help! Help! He's bursting all your hedges, and he's crushing all your crops. You must be bold and quick, master, or you will soon have nothing left. Help!" Garm began to howl.
"Shut up!"
said the farmer, and he shut the window.
"Lord a mercy,"
he said to himself, and thought the night was warm. And though the night was warm, he shivered and shook. "Get back to bed and don't be a fool," said his wife. "And drown that dog in the morning. There's no call to believe what a dog says. They'll tell any tale when caught truant or thieving."
"Maybe, Agatha,"
said he.
"and maybe not. But there's something going on in my fields, or Garm's a rabbit. That dog was frightened. And why should he come yammering in the night when he could sneak in at the back door with the milk in the morning?"
"Don't stand there arguing," said she. "If you believe the dog, then take his advice. Be bold and quick."
"Easier said than done,"
answered Giles. For, indeed, he believed quite half of Garm's tale. In the small hours of the night, giants seem less unlikely. Still, property is property, and Farmer Giles had a short way with trespassers who that few could outface. So he pulled on his breeches and went down into the kitchen and took his blunderbuss from the wall. Some may well ask what a blunderbuss was. Indeed, this very question, it is said, was put to the 4 wise clerks of Oxenford, and after thought they replied, "A blunderbuss is a short gun with a large bore firing many balls or slugs, and capable of doing execution within a limited range without exact aim, now superseded in civilized countries by other firearms." However, Farmer Giles' blunderbuss had a wide mouth that opened like a horn, and it did not fire balls or slugs, but anything that he could spare to stuff in it. And it did not do execution, because he seldom loaded it and never let it off. The sight of it was usually enough for his purpose. And this country was not yet civilized, for the blunderbuss was not superseded, and it was indeed the only kind of gun that there was, and rare at that. People preferred bows and arrows and used gunpowder mostly for fireworks. Well then, Farmer Giles took down the blunderbuss, and he put in a good charge of powder, just in case extreme measures should be required, and into the wide mouth he stuffed old nails and bits of wire, pieces of broken pot, bones and stones and other rubbish. Then he drew on his top boots and his overcoat, and he went out through the kitchen garden. The moon was low behind him, and he could see nothing worse than the long black shadows of bushes and trees, but he could hear a dreadful stamping, stumping, coming up the side of the hill. He did not feel either bold or quick, whatever Agatha might say, but he was more anxious about his property than his skin. So feeling a bit loose about the belt, he walked towards the brow of the hill. Suddenly, up over the edge of it, the giant's face appeared, pale in the moonlight, which glittered in his large round eyes. His feet were still far below, making holes in the fields. The moon dazzled the giant, and he did not see the farmer, but Farmer Giles saw him, and was scared out of his wits. He pulled the trigger without thinking, and the blunderbuss went off with a staggering bang. By luck, it was pointed more or less at the giant's large, ugly face. Out flew the rubbish and the stones and the bones and the bits of crock and wire and half a dozen nails. And since the range was indeed limited, by chance and no choice of the farmers, many of these things struck the giant. A piece of pot went into his eye, and a large nail stuck in his nose.
"Blast!"
said the giant in his vulgar fashion.
"I'm stung!"
The noise had made no impression on him. He was rather deaf, but he did not like the nail. It was a long time since he had met any insect fierce enough to pierce his thick skin, but he had heard tell that away east in the fens there were dragonflies that could bite like hot pincers. He thought that he must have run into something of the kind.
"Nasty, unhealthy parts, evidently,"
said he.
"I shan't go any further this way tonight."
So he picked up a couple of sheep off the hillside to eat when he got home, and went back over the river, making off about northwest at a great pace. He found his way home again in the end, for he was at last going in the right direction, but the bottom was burned off his copper pot. As for Farmer Giles, when the blunderbuss went off, it knocked him over flat on his back. And there he lay looking at the sky and wondering if the giant's feet would miss him as they passed by. But nothing happened, and the stamping, stumping died away in the distance. So he got up, rubbed his shoulder, and picked up the blunderbuss. Then suddenly he heard the sound of people cheering. Most of the people of Ham had been looking out of their windows. A few had put on their clothes and came out after the giant had gone away. Some were now running up the hill, shouting. The villagers had heard the horrible thump, thump of the giant's feet, and most of them had immediately got under the bedclothes. Some had gotten under the beds. But Garm was both proud and frightened of his master. He thought him terrible and splendid when he was angry, and he naturally thought that any giant would think the same. So, as soon as he saw Giles come out with the blunderbuss, a sign of great wrath as a rule, he rushed off to the village, barking and crying, "Come out, come out, come out! Get up, get up!" Come and see my great master. He is bold and quick. He's going to shoot a giant for trespassing. Come out. The top of the hill could be seen from most of the houses. When the people and the dog saw the giant's face rise above it, they quailed and held their breath, and all but the dog among them thought that this would prove a matter too big for Giles to deal with. Then the blunderbuss went bang, and the giant turned suddenly and went away. And in their amazement and their joy, they clapped and cheered, and Garm nearly barked his head off. "Hooray!" they shouted. "That will learn him! Master Agidius has given him what for? Now he will go home and die, and serve him right and proper." Then they all cheered again together. But even as they cheered, they took note for their own profit that after all this blunderbuss could really be fired. There had been some debate in the village inns on that point, but now the matter was settled. Farmer Giles had little trouble with trespassers after that. When all seemed safe, some of the bolder folk came right up the hill and shook hands with Farmer Giles. A few, the parson and the blacksmith and the miller, and one or two other persons of importance, slapped him on the back. That did not please him. His shoulder was very sore, but he felt obliged to invite them into his house. They sat around in the kitchen drinking his health and loudly praising him. He made no effort to hide his yawns, but as long as the drink lasted, they took no notice. By the time they had all had one or two, and the farmer 2 or 3, he began to feel quite bold. When they had all had 2 or 3, and he himself 5 or 6, he felt as bold as his dog thought him. They parted good friends, and he slapped their backs heartily. His hands were large, red, and thick, so he had his revenge. Next day, he found that the news had grown in the telling, and he had become an important local figure. By the middle of the next week, the news had spread to all the villages within 20 miles. He had become the hero of the countryside. Very pleasant, he found it. Next market day, he got enough free drink to float a boat. That is to say, he nearly had his fill, and came home singing old heroic songs. At last, even the king got to hear it. The capital of that realm, the middle kingdom of the island in those happy days, was some 20 leagues distant from Ham, and they paid little heed at court, as a rule, to the doings of rustics in the provinces. But so prompt an expulsion of a giant so injurious seemed worthy of note and of some little courtesy. So in due course, that is, in about 3 months, and on the feast of St. Michael, the king sent a magnificent letter. It was written in red upon white parchment, and expressed the royal approbation of "our loyal subjects and well-beloved Agidius Ahenobarbus Julius Agricola de Hamo." The letter was signed with a red blot, but the court scribe had added, "Ego Augustus Bonifacius Ambrosius Aurelianalis Antonius Pius et Magnificus Dux Rex Tyrannus et Basilius Mediterranearum Partium Subscribo," and a large red seal was attached, so the document was plainly genuine. It afforded great pleasure to Giles and was much admired, especially when it was discovered that one could get a seat and a drink by the farmer's fire by asking to look at it. Better than the testimonial was the accompanying gift. The king sent a belt and a longsword. To tell the truth, the king had never used the sword himself. It belonged to the family and had been hanging in his armory time out of mind. The armorer could not say how it came there, or what might be the use of it. Plain heavy swords of that kind were out of fashion at court just then, so the king thought it the very thing for a present to a rustic. But Farmer Giles was delighted, and his local reputation became enormous. Giles much enjoyed the turn of events. So did his dog. He never got his promised whipping. Giles was a just man, according to his lights. In his heart he gave a fair share of the credit to Garm, though he never went so far as to mention it. He continued to throw hard words and hard things at the dog when he felt inclined, but he winked at many little outings. Garm took to walking far afield. The farmer went about with a high step, and luck smiled on him. The autumn and early winter work went well, and all seemed set fair until the dragon came. In those days, dragons were already getting scarce in the island. None had been seen in the midland realm of Augustus Bonifacius for many a year. There were, of course, the dubious marches and the uninhabited mountains, westward and northward, but they were a long way off. In those parts, once upon a time, there had dwelt a number of dragons of one kind or another. They said they removed the 40-minute limit. Okay. And they had made raids far and wide. But the Middle Kingdom was in those days famous for the daring of the king's knights. And so many stray dragons had been killed or had returned with grave damage that the others gave up going that way. It was still the custom for dragon's tail to be served up at the king's Christmas feast. And each year a knight was chosen for the duty of hunting. He was supposed to set out upon St. Nicholas Day and come home with the dragon's tail not later than the eve of the feast. But for many years now, the royal cook had made a marvelous confection, a mock dragon's tail of cake and almond paste, with cunning scales of hard icing sugar. The chosen knight then carried this into the hall on Christmas Eve while the fiddles played and the trumpets rang. The mock dragon's tail was eaten after dinner on Christmas Day, and everybody said, to please the cook, that it tasted much better than real tail. That was the situation when a real dragon turned up again. The giant was largely to blame. After his adventure, he used to go about in the mountains visiting his scattered relations more than had been his custom, and much more than they liked, for he was always trying to borrow a large copper pot. But whether he got the loan of one or not, he would sit and talk in his long-winded, lumbering fashion about the excellent country down away east, and all the wonders of the wide world. He had got it into his head that he was a great and daring traveler.
"A nice land," he would say. "Pretty flat, soft to the feet, and plenty to eat for the taking. Cows, you know, and sheep all over the place. Easy to spot if you look carefully." "But what about the people?"
said they.
"I never saw any," said he. "There was not a knight to be seen or heard, my dear fellows. Nothing worse than a few stinging flies by the river." "Why don't you go back and stay there?" said they. "Oh, well, there's no place like home, say they," said he. "But maybe I shall go back one day when I have a mind. And anyway, I went there once, which is more than most folk can say. Now, about that copper pot and these rich lands," they would hurriedly ask. these delectable regions full of undefended cattle, which way do they lie, and how far off? Oh,
he would answer.
Away east or southeast, but it's a long journey.
And then he would give such an exaggerated account of the distance that he had walked and the woods, hills, and plains that he had crossed, that none of the other less long-legged giants ever set out. Still, the talk got about. Then the warm summer was followed by a hard winter. It was bitter cold in the mountains and food was scarce. The talk got louder. Lowland sheep and kine from the deep pastures were much discussed. The dragons pricked up their ears. They were hungry, and these rumors were attractive. So, knights are mythical, said the younger and less experienced dragons. We always thought so.
At least they may be getting rare,
thought the older and wiser worms.
Far and few, and no longer to be feared.
There was one dragon who was deeply moved. Chrysophylax Dives was his name, for he was of ancient and imperial lineage and very rich. He was cunning, inquisitive, greedy, well-armored, but not overbold. But at any rate, he was not in the least afraid of flies or insects of any sort or size, and he was mortally hungry. So one winter's day, about a week before Christmas, Chrysophylax spread his wings and took off. He landed quietly in the middle of the night, plump in the heart of the midland realm of Augustus Bonifacius Rex A. Bissalius. He did a deal of damage in a short while, smashing and burning, and devouring sheep, cattle, and horses. This was in a part of the land a long way from Ham, but Garm got the fright of his life. He had gone off on a long expedition, and taking advantage of his master's favor, he had ventured to spend a night or two away from home. He was following an engaging scent along the eaves of a wood when he turned a corner and came suddenly upon a new and alarming smell. He ran indeed, slap into the tail of Chrysophylax Dives, who had just landed. Never did a dog turn his own tail round and bolt home swifter than Garm. The dragon, hearing his yelp, turned and snorted, but Garm was already far out of range. He ran all the rest of the night and arrived home about breakfast time. "Help! Help! Help!" he cried outside the back door. Giles heard and did not like the sound of it. It reminded him that unexpected things may happen when all seems to be going well.
"Wife, let that dratted dog in,"
said he,
"and take a stick to him."
Garm came bundling into the kitchen, with his eyes starting and his tongue hanging out. "Help!" he cried.
"Now, what have you been a-doing this time?"
said Giles, throwing a sausage at him. "Nothing," panted Garm, too flustered to give heed to the sausage.
"Well, stop doing it, or I'll skin you,"
said the farmer. "I've done nothing wrong. I didn't mean no harm," said the dog. "But I came on a dragon, accidental-like, and it frightened me." The farmer choked in his beer.
"Dragon?"
said he.
"Drat you for a good-for-nothing nosy Parker. What do you want to go and find a dragon for? At this time of the year? And me with my hands full. Where was it?"
"Oh, north over the hills and far away, beyond the standing stones and all," said the dog.
"Oh, away there,"
said Giles, mighty relieved.
"They're queer folk in those parts, I've heard tell, and aught might happen in their land. Let them get on with it. Don't come worriting me with such tales. Get out!
Garm got out and spread the news all over the village. He did not forget to mention that his master was not scared in the least. Quite cool he was, and went on with his breakfast. People chatted about it pleasantly at their doors. How like old times, they said. Just as Christmas is coming too, so seasonable. How pleased the king will be. He will be able to have real tail this Christmas. But more news came in next day. The dragon, it appeared, was exceptionally large and ferocious. He was doing terrible damage. What about the king's knights? People began to say. And that is the end of our story for tonight. And we will continue.